going to talk about writing your evidence. This should be a fairly simple process once you have your evidence selected. First step is to have your evidence available. You should have done this in the previous step so you know what you're going to use. The most important thing is to decide whether to quote that evidence or to paraphrase it, meaning to present it in your own words. Keep in mind, most things should be paraphrased. You should read the evidence guidelines in this step, previous document, but keep in mind that unless someone is speaking that quote who is an expert, who is saying something in a particularly meaningful way, you should write it in your own words. You may present numbers, facts, data as they are because it would be inappropriate to change them from their true form, but the way that it's presented should be in your own voice. And it should be written in a concise way without going on and on. You'll be able to explain that evidence in the analysis later. For now, in this step, you just need to get it down and present it. So let's take a look at a sample of how this works. Here is evidence that I selected previously in another step for an argumentative paper about the worst pandemic of all time. And I decided to use the 1918 influenza pandemic as the worst. And my evidence was about mortality rate. So for the 1918 pandemic, I have a 10 to 20% mortality rate. And then I found mortality rates for these other diseases to compare it to. And I decided that all of those would be good to use as evidence in my paper. So now I need to take these and write them together into my evidence section of my paragraph. And we'll see how that looks below. The mortality rate of the 1918 influenza was 10 to 20%. See, I'm putting that in my own words here. I have that number that I'm not changing, but it's my own voice, it's my own language. I'm then going to compare it to the others. In comparison, other major historical pandemics have a wider range depending on the situation. Now, that's me transitioning from one piece of evidence to the next. Now I'm going to present these numbers. Smallpox varied from 1 to 30%. Cholera could be 1 to 60% depending on whether a patient received treatment, and the bubonic plague was similar to cholera with a 1% to 50% mortality rate depending on treatment. COVID-19 has a roughly 4% mortality rate. So you see, all of that comes from here as far as the numbers, the situations of whether it's treated or untreated, and the ranges for those. I'm just writing them in a way that flows and kind of moves from one to the next and kind of combines some where that opportunity presents itself. So that is putting the evidence together. I'm not making any judgments about it. I'm not making any analysis. I'm going to save that until after I presented the evidence, but this step must be done first before that can happen. So it should be clear, it should be concise, and it should largely be in your own words, aside from those specific things that cannot be presented any other way, like the name of a disease or a certain percentage or a year or something like that. All right, give it a shot in writing your evidence.